In my background, I worked first after graduating in computer animation as a game artist, working on titles like Gangs of London at Sony's London studio. But then I quit to study classical art when I realized that the artist I wanted to be has to study traditional media. And so I took 2 years out to focus on figurative painting and enjoyed it so much I thought I would become a professional portrait painter working in oil. But more recently, it's actually exploring the overlap between these two disciplines in a way, so traditional art and video games. And what is most relevant to the talk today is a sketch club that I organize here in Zurich, where we have different cosplayers come every 2 weeks. So we have Maleficent in the top right. Next, in a week or two, we have Harry Potter coming, someone dressed as Harry Potter. And what the session is about is more of an animation approach to drawing, where you just have 1 minute, 2 minutes, or 5 minutes to capture the essence of the pose. So what is the dynamic energy of this character? So when we look at these drawings a bit more closely, you can see that every line has a value. It might be describing the costume and something about the figure, a cultural reference. But more importantly, a straight line has a supportive value, a curved line feels more dynamic. And it's these nuances, this understanding of what is the aesthetic value of each individual line, which is the foundation of my work. And I'm very happy to share with you the endorsements that I've received for the 2 books that I wrote. One endorsement is from Mark Forster, the Hollywood director, who highlighted the transmedia value in storytelling of these concepts that I'll share with you today, as well as Stefan Asadurian, who's one of the founding members of the Assassin's Creed franchise, who also highlighted the universal storytelling structure of my work. And what that structure comes down to is really very, very simple. It's the circle, the square, and the triangle. And so what I like to do at the beginning of my presentations is to ask all of you, if you were to pick one of these shapes, which one would you identify yourselves with? And it's not, you don't have to call it out. This is just something very personal for you to decide. Knowing that it is a very subjective, that the feeling you might have in deciding which one might feel very subjective at this moment. You know, it's sometimes very difficult for us to understand, you know, what am I as a presenter asking of you to define? It becomes a little easier if I ask you, if you had all the money in the world, or some of you might have enough to buy your dream car already, which shape would the car align with? Would it be something like a Porsche or a Volkswagen Beetle, a Hummer, or a Range Rover, or something very edgy like a Lamborghini? And that becomes a bit more easier to say, okay, I'm definitely a Porsche kind of person, for instance. It becomes even easier, perhaps, to more objective when we decide, when I ask you to simulate the gestures you would do when signing a contract or signing something, or autographing a book, for instance. The idea is that if you just hold your hands out, and maybe for those of you who don't feel too self-conscious about it, you can even try it now. So just try to simulate the gestures. And then the idea is that, if you had actually written this down or performed this while drawing and had something to look at on a piece of paper, you could then say, is my signature more aligned to the circular shape concept, to the horizontal and vertical lines, or is it very triangular? And that sort of says something about your physical tension as well. So you're projecting something about yourself outwards through lines. And this, in a way, this experiment becomes very interesting when we start to study signatures by other people. So if I could ask you to, for those who don't feel self-conscious, for those who do, please don't worry about this, just to sort of simulate drawing, copying the gestures of the signature now. So, and while you're doing so, what are the feelings that you feel, the physical feelings that you feel while doing that performance. Okay. Yeah, and that's, yeah, accuracy is not important. Just the general flow of the lines, as if you were drawing, making a copy or studying a character in a way. It's very similar. Whereas try doing the same for this one. So, of course, this one feels very, very different and much more jagged. And what's interesting is that what you've just done is you've simulated Barack Obama's signature versus Donald Trump's. And so by performing, so by performing these gestures, what you've done is you've physically empathized with each of these characters, your figures, real life figures, that you may never have the opportunity to meet them, but by simulating their gestures through their signature, you've experienced something about their personality. You've embodied their characters. And so in the context of storytelling, which was the main topic of tonight's event, what we could do is, in a very simple way, sort of line these signatures up and just treat them as a simple narrative. The line, becomes a narrative. And if you imagine starting with Barack Obama's signature, going to Donald Trump's and returning to Barack's, it's sort of like you have a start, a very relaxed start. We have a moment of tension and then a restoration of the norm afterwards. Okay. As more, that's comment was more loaded than I pictured it in my head when I put this presentation together. So that. So what we have, what we're looking at now, again, is this shape language, the circle, square, and triangle. And so the question is, what is shape language for all of us? And it has a very ancient root. So even the ancient Greeks, who, of course, invented the Platonic solids, which we still use in modern day 3D software, sort of like Cinema 4D Maya, they were trying to theorize, what is our world made of, just like the atoms are, our understanding of atoms is today. And so we had the 5 classic elements. Here are 3 of them. And when they were thinking, so which of these Platonic solids, these component parts of our universe represent water, they thought it's the sphere. And the sphere, in a very tactile sense, is something that rolls around. Is very, is a very dynamic shape. So they thought, okay, the sphere must be water. If we were to be able to zoom down at a sort of microscopic level. They theorized that the cube is Earth because of it has the largest mass, and it can also tessellate very easily. So there was a natural conclusion, but also a tactile conclusion that they associated with this shape. And lastly was the pyramids associated with fire. And again, this was a tactile conclusion because fire has a very painful, stinging sensation when you touch it. And the pyramids, so too, it has these sharp points that we feel, when we interact with this object, this Platonic solid. And so we already see this relationship emerging between a shape language, physical experience, and tactile sensations. And this is what interaction is about when we're designing video games, virtual reality, augmented reality. Of course, we're sort of in some way detached from the virtual experience, but we want to embody it, especially in an artistic context. But the interesting thing is that we don't even have to interact with things physically to sense some way, to have a physical empathy towards them. Because our bodies are sort of the way we function is that we have mirror neurons that fire away every time we, for instance, on the left, enter a space or appreciate a piece of art that is sort of full of very curved and dynamic shapes. Then our body starts to respond to these on a very subconscious level. And this can be very subtle to the point that, of course, you're not even aware of it. Whereas if you enter a space which has very jagged shapes, or an artwork which is very aggressive, then our body, the muscles can even be triggered relating to what the action of the figure that you're looking at is doing. And just to prove or sort of give you a sense of a heightened sense of how these mirror neurons work, here's an example of like a parkour experience. And for anyone who's watching, has very severe vertigo, you might want to look away. But for those who can just hold on long enough just to feel the sensation.
Yeah. Hey. Okay.
So what that highlights for those who, especially for those who have vertigo, is that you're not there. You're not the person doing the jumping, but your body is responding physically to what you're seeing. And those are what the mirror neurons are doing. When you look at art, which is very curved or has very static horizontal and vertical lines, or is very sharp, your body naturally responds to this. But how can we go a step further and enter this tactile space? But just to sort of continue this discussion of like, what is shape language? Where does it come from? It actually comes from nature. So we have here sort of things which objects which have been evolving for thousands or millions of years, and have arrived at natural solutions that make them efficient in the doing the things that they have evolved to do. So on the left, we have a dolphin, and of course, a dolphin is full of curved and fluid lines, which make it as aerodynamic and fast as possible. If that dolphin was shaped like a Minecraft character with a very boxy nose, then of course it just wouldn't be efficient. We can't replace the curved lines of the dolphin with any of the other two shapes. It just wouldn't work. A tree as heavy as this one that has to grow vertically to keep its balance, to stay upright. Of course, the minute it was tilted to give a more triangular, to reference the triangular shape concept, then of course it would fall over. This efficiency, the balance is necessary for it to grow as tall as it does. And canine teeth have naturally evolved to cut things and slice through things efficiently because they are efficient at doing that. That we can't replace sharp teeth with marshmallow shapes and expect the same effect. And engineers throughout history have noticed this. We can go back to ancient Sumerian cultures. The cartwheels are round. This can't be changed. We can't escape that. Stonehenge, the stones at Stonehenge are still standing to this day, despite being, over 2,500 years old, or BC. And the oldest known spear, I think it's 420,000 years old, this Clecton spear, of course, has a sharp point. This is, sort of ancient engineers referencing nature to arrive at solutions that nature offered us for engineering challenges. So how does this fit into art? Shape language is something that's around us everywhere, but it's a hidden art form somewhat, and it sort of relates to composition in design. And so here we have a painting by Raphael. And what I want to highlight is that, on the left, there's the cultural content. And on the right is where I'm going to sort of place the craft, what things that belong to this painting in the craft category. And so what is cultural content? So the cultural content here is Mary, which is something that is very specific to a particular religion, and not all cultures will be aware of it. Even the halo above the two figures, there's also something that is very unique to a particular religion, and also something that is not objective. It's something that's not universal. And even the fabrics of the characters, they're very specific to this period. We will never understand the meaning, the value of these fabrics in the same way that the artist did at the time. It's his choice, and maybe very localized to his region in the world. And even the oil paint itself is of like cultural content value, because the oil paint that Raphael was using is very different to the one that we use now. And maybe some people have never had any contact with oil paint in this form at all. So these are all things which come under cultural content. Whereas the craft is something that is more objective and more universal. It comes in the form of the composition and the structure, the shape language that the artist has chosen on which to construct and place these items. So the cultural content. So nothing in this image has been randomly positioned. The artist would have spent months, if not years, arranging and manipulating every single aspect of this image to create this circular motif. So that includes, you can include shadow shapes, contour lines, fabric elements, decorations. And these are all geared towards specific functions, which I'll cover in a moment. But the idea is that these are not things that you should be aware of if you haven't studied classical art. That Raphael broke this circular shape concept, this primary one, deliberately, so that you would focus on the cultural content and be immersed in the narrative without being aware of the construction. And in a film, so an analogy in film would be that when you're watching The Lord of the Rings or something like that, you don't want to see a camera person or a microphone dip into the frame, because then you become very aware of the craft, or sort of how this is all being staged. And so it's important that this is always remains hidden. This is where it works at its best. And what we're doing is we're sort of deciding on how to deliver the cultural content while not making it explicit, not making it central. But you may have noticed that there's an additional shape hidden within here, and that's the one of the triangle, which is also sort of embedded within this compositional structure. And this is to highlight that shape language is what I will focus on, and I'll sort of discuss the nuances shortly, but there's also possibilities to create compositions that use cultural content as well. So, of course, the Holy Trinity being here, the central shape within this composition. But it's important to highlight that shape language still overrides cultural content. So people will still can have the value of shape language modulated by cultural conditioning. But if we place two paintings side by side with very similar content, and in some way magically ignore the triangle in the left painting, then you'll notice that the left painting still has a much more delicate, rounded effect than the one on the right. And this is just to highlight that the composition itself is, we still return to our ingrained responses to circles, squares, and triangles. And it's something that I'll reinforce with other examples as we go. And sorry, before I forget, that this is stuff that, because the compositions are usually embedded within the painting and sort of just beyond your perception, how they're working on you as an untrained viewer is at the pre-attentive stage of cognition. So it's the idea that they remain just out of your conscious perception, but your subconscious is very aware of those sort of on a much more primal level. So what are the functions of composition? So one is just pure, simple visual simplification. Painting here by Rubens is incredibly complex, so many figures and details meshed together. And so what the composition does is it gives you a very simple visual statement, which enhances the immersion and your focus on the artwork itself. So here I have an example, sort of like something for you to try. If I could ask you to just focus on the circle on the screen, and just think about what your eye is doing. What should be happening is pretty much nothing. That it should be a very comfortable experience, that your eye is not tempted to shift away from the circle. Whereas if I add vignettes, this experience becomes even easier. Your eye is even less tempted to go away and move away from this circle. And so this is the equivalent of creating a very simple composition like the ones in the Rubens or the Raphael example, where you're immersed in the painting, you're held there by this hidden structure, and especially if vignettes are added, and you're not tempted to sort of think about what's around the painting. The painting has captured your attention. Whereas if I ask you to focus on one of these shapes in this image, so just one of them, you'll notice that your eye becomes very irritated. It's sort of just subtly tempted to move away and explore the rest of the canvas. And this is the equivalent of an artwork that has no compositional structure added for simplification purposes. So it's just a chaotic scene, and what this does is it creates a lot of work for your audience. they then have to sort of navigate it and orientate themselves around the cultural content because you have not offered them a simple guide with which to work with. So we have visual simplification. Another is that a visual guide in the sense that anything which sits along the compositional structure will get more attention than things that are not. So the artists can use that to direct your attention to specific areas of interest. And these are, of course, complemented by just other aesthetic contrast, so contrast of color, contrast of value that you can complement with that. But in a sense, it's a visual guide that's very useful for us as designers. But most relevant to shape language is that a composition allows us to create, have a holistic shape structure. So holism, of course, is just thinking about how everything fits together. But thinking about the shape that you choose for this experience, of course, has aesthetic value. Do you choose something which is aligned with a circle, a square, or triangle, or something that is purely of cultural content value? But in a sense, these are really important techniques, and the old masters, laid the groundwork for this. And so it's important that we don't ignore this. And just to sort of highlight that this is not something that belongs to the Renaissance and periods of old. Even Kandinsky, who is one of the pioneers of abstract painting, who ended up painting in just circles, squares, and triangles, said that the content of a work of art finds its expression in the composition. So in the sum of the tensions inwardly organized for the work. So this is sort of just thinking about how everything combines together, sits together. So the next question to ask is, I've shown you sort of some European, classical European art. So it's maybe good to ask, like, are these concepts of composition and in particular shape language of worldwide aesthetic value? So we'll start with Buddhist culture. And originally, Buddha didn't have a human form. It was just he was presented by things which were associated with him. So in this case, we have his footprint. But the ancient Greeks invaded Asia. So this is the Gandhara region. So it's modern day Pakistan and Afghanistan. And what suddenly appeared at this time are the human representations of Buddha. And this is a particularly interesting image because Buddha's protector god is referencing directly Hercules from ancient Greek philosophy, law. But returning to shape language, what is particularly interesting about Buddha's pose is the shape in which he's being constructed. So you can see this is a triangular shape of a very flat base, and it's very symmetrical. So there's a lot of stability, but this triangle has been rounded at the corners, and everything about his drapery and his facial features are very rounded. So we have a triangular shape, a balanced one, symmetrical, with rounded corners and rounded shapes. And Buddha's pose, this one, is an aid to meditation. So the function of this statue is to encourage you to sit in this pose. Especially if if you do yoga, then you'll understand that this pose encourages you to bring stability and calmness into your physical body. His Buddha's protector god, on the other hand, has a much more triangular pose. And as this figure evolved and went further into Asia and onto Japan, turned into the Neo gods, which stand outside temples in Japan as two figures. But you can see that the shape language of the pose of this character is much more tilted and skewed to one side. And what's interesting that the Zen monk Suzuki Shosan encouraged his followers to adopt this pose in the same way that Buddha encourages you to sit in a particular calm way. But with the Neo, the idea was that whenever you needed to feel aggressive and have power in you, whenever at times of need, at times of stress, then this pose would give you that energy. So again, it's a relationship between shape language and sort of this embodiment of and physical empathy towards something which you may not even be interacting with physically through touch. But the relationship between physical gestures and shape language. And the cultural content, then of course, none of us will understand the meaning of all the other symbols within this artwork to the same way that a Tibetan monk would while painting this. So in reference to the Barack Obama and Donald Trump signature thread, you could also imagine sitting in a pose like the Buddha, then getting into an aggressive style pose, and then back again. And we have the semblance of a narrative of some sort, something that is embodied and actually changes your mood. This is also something which is true, that the way we stand, that we project ourselves, also changes how we feel on the inside. Islamic arts too, we have shape language here at work, and Islamic arts also had a very strong influence from ancient Greek culture, because the ancient Greeks invaded south as well. And what is interesting is that they of course, it's aniconic. There's no figurative work in Islamic art, but it was still an art founded on the study of nature. So in the same way, they took the things which were universal to all cultures, in reference to the dolphin example and the sharp teeth, but it was symbolizing Allah's perfection, the primary shapes, but intricately combined to illustrate Allah's infinite complexity. So we still see the same shape language at work here, and it's no surprise that the most important architectural object in Islamic culture is the cube. It's sort of like the solid, stable, everlasting shape that it represents as a natural form. And in all these examples, in the Buddhist examples that I gave, and also here, that it's not that ancient Greeks dominated, and the culture just drifted in one direction. We can see here a Christian painting, and there's a Persian rug. And also, if you ever see representations of Jesus with gestures like this, they're also in reference to Buddhist culture. Shifting slightly away from religion and sort of worldly cultures, we can also perceive shape language in sort of everyday experiences that we have. So this is the Volkswagen Beetle website. We can start at the logo for the Volkswagen, but also the vehicle itself. Which shape does it align to? And it's very easy to see. Of course, it's the circular shape concept. But everything about it is based on the visual DNA, from the shape of the lights, the wing mirrors, even like the sockets for the door handles, are all attuned to this visual DNA that is part of the identity of this vehicle. And when the graphic designer was constructing this image, they also chose a bridge which echoes the visual DNA of the vehicle. So in a way, that's in reference to Kandinsky, the message here is that this vehicle exists is built for this city. In a way, this the subtext. But as a designer, we always have to be very aware of the visual DNA and make sure that it saturates the whole experience. So, what would you expect to happen if I press the arrow for the carousel for the images to shift? Even what kind of animation would you implement? Would it be something that's very sudden and aggressive? Of course, there's going to be something with a slow in, slow out animation that somehow references the shape language. And this is exactly what happens. So it's not too fast, very delicate. We have another screen, and the shape language of the environment mirrors the original image, which is in reference to the car itself. What about the male testosterone of the Lamborghini? Can we see the similar concepts applied here? So starting with the logo in the top right is definitely more triangular. And the vehicle is just one ball of angry muscle in a way, because today's vehicles are designed with faces embedded within them, and so you can picture the lights of the vehicle as being the eyes, the badge, the nose, the bonnet being like the tension lines that you get when you're very angry, but everything, even the teeth. So it's almost like a shark. There's this vehicle, but everything has been sharpened and very, very different to the Volkswagen Beetle. But also the setting, we have a very jagged environment. So the message here, the subtext is that the angry driver of this angry vehicle is in a very dangerous place, and this is the weapon to drive to survive. What about if we click on the carousel, then of course we're going to get a suitable aesthetic experience that somehow conveys the speed of this vehicle, but also the aggression. And this, you can see it's just no ease in or out. The animation just happens instantly. In reference to Google, our host, kind host for today, this is a space in Dublin, which I found on the internet. I haven't been there before, but you can see that a space designed to be inspiring and relaxing and to encourage creativity has been saturated with curved round shapes, from the weave of the carpet, which doesn't necessarily dictate how you move through the space, but at least visually softens the experience or encourages you in some way to move in that manner. The soft edges of the sofa, the ceiling fixtures, the coat hanger, the choice of the plant pots. Everything is being shifted towards the circular shape concept, whereas compare that to the Denver Art Museum, which you can see in the inset is from the outside just looks like a blade stuck in the ground. Something that you could 3D print on a small scale, stick on a stick and threaten people with. Whereas inside, just think about what the tactile experience is of running your hand down that staircase. It's going to be very different to the sofa in the Google Dublin office. If we shift media to comic book design, and so what I'll do now is I have a series of comic and film and animation examples, and I'll give you a bit of a head start to try and find the compositional structure within these artworks. And you'll see it's, even though you're looking for it, it's still sometimes hard to find. But in this case, what we have is, comic book frames are usually vertical, so to increase the tension value of this fight scene between these two space cowboys, the frames are tilted. The speech bubbles, of course, are much more angular, but what's most important is this triangular line of movement across from right to left, it being a Japanese comic. And so here we can see that the line, again, is the narrative. If you change the line and place the gestures of these figures in a much more curving, fluid motion, then it would look more like a slapping, a gentle, graceful stroking experience rather than sort of a zigzagging, threatening punch. In the Dolce & Gabbana adverts, we have this composition embedded there as well. But in this case, it's much more on the cultural content side, because embedded within this is the motif of Cupid, where we have triangles, a triangular arrow sort of pointing at the heart shape on the right. In Akira Kurosawa's work, Akira Kurosawa is one of the most celebrated directors in the world, and he very greatly inspired people like George Lucas, because the way he constructs the image is, in a way, very decadent. He just spends as much time as he needs micro positioning every single actor and prop within the image to create these beautifully simple compositions, which are as simple as the old masters, like we saw with the Raphael. And so in this case, we have this kind of zigzagging wave. And you can see that even the characters, which are supposed to representing dead soldiers on the ground, each one of them has had their leg positioned in a way to lead up to this figure, which is jumping off the platform. And so you can imagine it's a hot day and the director saying, please, can you move your right leg 10 centimeters to the right, a bit back? And this is the kind of work that is involved in creating this sense of simplicity, this engaging simplicity. And it sort of highlights that simplicity is very hard to achieve. Complexity is the equivalent of just, you can arrive at complex things very easily, but to get very simple designs takes a lot of hard work. In Guardians of the Galaxy as well, here we have the advantage of post-production techniques and so on, and which can even adjust the gestures of the actors. But of course, it just means that the actors also have to know where to stand and what the concept artists develop for the scene in advance, what is going to be a real prop, what is going to be digitized. And in this case, we have a tilted square. which is a combination of gestures of the actors, foreground props, background props, and some sort of semblance of a vignette. Sometimes it's sort of also subjective. We can't really say what the director was really thinking, but there's a definite tilted square that embedded within that. If you've watched Pixar's Up, then you'll know that Carl is the sort of the stuck character, the one who finds it hard to move on. And of course, what shape is best suited for that is no doubt the square. And Ellie is the dynamic character, the one that brings the dynamic energy and impulsive sort of decisions to the relationship. And if you read through the art of book for Pixar, then on one of the very first pages, you see that Carl has been depicted as a square and Ellie has been depicted as a circle. And so this is just a fantastic example of, a mainstream, a huge company, Pixar and Disney, using shape language because it speaks to people of all ages and all cultures. And everything about these characters, the visual DNA of each of the respective characters, has been applied to everything associated with them. So Carl's square glasses, he has a square on his book, a square chair, square lampshade. Ellie has a much more dynamic pose, a very circular head, circular so teacup and lampshade. So this is just, it's a very strong expression of who these characters are on the inside, expressed through shape language, something that we all understand. And then we have the Lord of the Rings, and I don't need to tell you that the hobbits are the goodies in this narrative. So they have very rounded shoulders. They live in round hobbit holes. Hobbiton itself, the Shire, has winding pathways and rolling hills. The elves, of course, how would you describe those? They are very sort of very straightforward, very logical characters, very balanced characters. And so their visual DNA is a combination of the vertical straight line and maybe some leaf nature motifs embedded in there. So you can see the figure on the left. You can see that through the way that the hair hangs down. It gives this sense of calmness that we feel about them. But also the positioning of his arrows. From memory, I'm sure you've seen plenty of arrows that stick out sideways. But the designers in this case made sure that there was this verticality in the positioning of the arrows on his back. Then, of course, in the middle, on the right, we have the queen sort of standing there in a very vertical pose, and the way she's holding the vase, is something that is designed to reference the visual DNA. And of course, they live in a forest. So where else would you find in nature lots of vertical lines? And of course, on the other end of the shape spectrum, in opposition to the circle, we have the triangular shape concept, and that's from the pointed tips of Sauron's glove to the triangle on his volcano. Everything is referencing this aesthetic, and that comes down to the color choices and materials and many other things. But this visual DNA is very, very important. And so with that, sort of, I hope that you sort of appreciate that shape language is a thing. It sort of has very deep roots in our DNA, and there are academic studies that prove that. And it sort of gives us a conceptual understanding of why this meme that I found online is so funny. It says that fonts matter. You'll always be mine, or you'll always be mine. And so why is it funny? So why is this funny? And the thing is that we, in the context of shape language and the signature copying exercise that I asked you to do at the beginning, we can understand what the physical tension of that character is. The one on the left, of course, is more fanciful and more fluid, and the one on the right has much more jagged movements. Yes?
What if we move the left and heart to the right? Would it change perception?
Oh yeah, I mean it does help that these are the ones on the right are much more brushier sort of impulsive strokes and the line quality, but it's still the physical tension of each character still will hold through. So yeah, and that's what I want to focus on for this. That it's not so much about the font itself; it's more about the physical tension that we perceive of each of the authors of this artwork. Oh yes, yeah, to yes, yeah. So, we will never know. We will never know. so, so in summary, in a way, for the fundamentals part of this presentation, we have the primary shapes: the circle, square, and triangle. And the squares we saw associated with balance, strength, restraint, tranquility, and rest. And it really just depends on the context. You can sort of apply this in very varied ways. The skewed triangle sort of conveys force, instability, aggression, or impulsion, things like that. And the circle, grace, positivity, continuity, and movement. And these represent our ABC of shape language. There are the roots that we always return to. As I demonstrated by the Pixar example in particular. And that's not to say that we can use secondary shapes, which are combinations of these primary shapes, or cultural symbols as well, to embed those in the composition. But the slight drawback of that is that the more we dilute these primary shapes, the more specific our audience becomes. And so it's important, the more you stick to the square, circle, and triangle, the easier it is for us to, as viewers, to understand the functional value and the aesthetic value of these shapes. And so just to have, the half circle, of course, is a reference to the beetle. The triangle, the balanced triangle of the curved edges, is a reference to the Buddha pose that we saw. And the skewed box we saw in the Guardians of the Galaxy example. And some of you may have studied the work of Duchamp. So Duchamp highlighted, revolutionized modern art, and he did many positive things for art, and and a lot of negative things for us who study classical techniques. In that he highlighted that he said without unashamedly that everything is subjective. But because he was an artist who created combined ready-made objects into artworks, he missed this opportunity to experience physical tension and the value of all these lines. And so there's someone who I respect more than Duchamp, who sort of champions my perspective, is Pablo Picasso, who, on hearing that Duchamp had died, having had a long feud with Duchamp, simply said he was wrong. So, okay. So how does this apply to interactive media? We have, going back to the Raphael example, cultural content and craft. In a video game context, we have a character like Super Mario, a Japanese, a video game icon of Japanese origin. Again, it might not be familiar to everybody, and that's why it's cultural value. And even pixels, they're becoming, as TV displays become more and more high resolution, the idea of the perception of pixels becomes less and less obvious to the everyday person. When computers first arrived, pixels were very central to the graphics. Whereas on the craft side, we're no longer dealing with a two-dimensional static canvas. We're dealing with something that can be very dynamic, from moment to moment, can change. And this is one additional interesting point about shape language, is that its basis is in maths, in the same way that video games and virtual reality experiences are based on mathematics as well. And of course, we're dealing with a three-dimensional space. So we're no longer experiencing passively or sort of semi-passively an artwork which we're looking at. In a sense, we're part of the artwork. We're standing inside it and creating it as we go, in collaboration with, in some sort of asynchronous collaboration with the designers of the experience. And this image that I've put in here is very important because it shows Glenn Keane, who was one of the old masters of the Disney golden periods, using Google's Tilt Brush. And so Tilt Brush is the equivalent of Photoshop, where you can just create artwork within the virtual space. And why this is important is because Tilt Brush is an uncurated experience. If Glenn Keane decides that he wants to create a very jagged, aggressive experience, he can. There's nothing telling him not to, and it's a blank canvas. If he wants to create something very curving and fluid, he can. There's nothing in Tilt Brush telling him that to guide him in this direction. And so when we come to storytelling, we have to find ways to orchestrate and influence viewers, sort of the participants within the space, to encourage them to to complete the shapes and perform the shapes that we have decided as part that are important to the storytelling experience. And so what I've done here, I've included a work in progress. In a way, it's a game design framework, or applicable to virtual reality and augmented reality as well. And it's a methodology for orchestrating this very experience that I described. So how it's constructed is that it highlights the main elements of an interactive experience. And so you cycle through it, and as you explore each one, you use shape language to try to manipulate the player to perform a particular action. And in general, the structure of it is that it works from very broad concepts, from very large scale influences to very local, minute influences, with the hope that the audience will respond in kind to the kind of ideas that you're applying. And these are a reference to how paintings and even comic books are designed, where you start off with a layout. This is the top row, which you can see there are lines which are guiding the viewer from one page to another, such as the path on the top and on the right, and these kind of, I don't know if it's rain on the other side. And this is all before the details are put in, before the graphics are put on top. So in a very simple demonstration, it's the idea that in a way we're starting with something that is equivalent to the construct in the matrix, where there is nothing, the player in Tilt Brush is also in a similar situation. There's nothing telling them what to do, what not to do. They create the content themselves. Whereas if we start with global objectives, then or even sort of things that are of desire to the player, or things that are a threat to the player, then we'll have a very simple flow of movement. The player will go towards points of interest and away through things which are of threat or threatening, or have a threatening aesthetic to them. So how do we start to shape that experience? And a very simple example is shaping the pathway along which they travel. If we make it very curving or very angular or very straight, the player will be encouraged to move with gestures. And this might be in a video game, of course, it might be a simple thing like the thumb, but in other experiences, we can explore other modes of interaction. And this is combined with the functionality of the surface along which they're traveling. So on the right, we have a screenshot from Horizon Zero Dawn, where walking through tall grass gives you a stealth bonus. So you're encouraged to move more stealthily and slowly through that space. So we have a combination of gameplay functionality and shape language, shaping the pathway to influence how the player feels and interacts with the space. If you're dealing with augmented reality games, like Rupert sort of mentioned, the Pokemon Go, then we don't have the same ability to redefine and dynamically change the environment in which the player is currently standing in. But as an artistic experiment, you can even just decide, where do specific events take place? Do they take place in a park, where we have a very very high likelihood that there'll be curving pathways? Parks, beaches, and so on have very curving pathways because they visually reduce the tension of the environment, but they also encourage you to walk in a particular way. Or do we have action take place in very straight functional lines, or very jagged ones, which are very, very rare to find? It took me 4 years to find that outside a conference space in Paris. I was very happy to have found it finally. We don't think of buildings as being tactile. We don't run our hands along buildings in the same way that a tree hugger would. But they do have tactile value. We understand the tactile value of buildings in the context of shape language. So again, if you're creating augmented reality experience, or even if you're creating a film or anything, where shape language is a value, then picking the setting and the interior that matches the aesthetics that support the narrative that you're trying to convey. Amelia Schatz sort of demonstrates in an article on 80 levels, that even in Uncharted, Uncharted is a game where you parkouring, so running around and climbing on objects is central to the game, central component of gameplay. And so she very clearly defines the block things that are actually of value for the parkouring part of gameplay by making sure that everything that wasn't related to that had a different shape language associated with it. So making the landscape more curving, so that, and things which are of danger or to be avoided to be triangular, so that the player can orientate themselves more easily, and through shape language's inherent universality to, of course, communicate with the player in a very primal way. And even when we're dealing with characters, the good characters tend to be very circular. Characters which are very mature in video games, or very tank-like, very powerful, align with the square shape concept. But it can also be very subtle. So something like in the costume, sort of a sense of verticality. It relates to my question of which car would you choose? That we'll naturally identify with a particular shape, and then also applies to what kind of clothing and decorations we choose for our house. And the triangle shapes don't mean that we tend to associate those with evil characters, but as with Tracer from Blizzard's Overwatch, the one with the kind of lightning bolts coming out of her back, in a way, the Tracer line. She's a positive character, and it just conveys a slightly edgier, more impulsive personality to, say, someone who's totally aligned to the circular shape concept. And of course, shape language doesn't work in isolation. She can also have, a character like this could also have very graceful, fluid lines, which would be an interesting contrast to the shape language. But aside from these things which I've just vaguely sort of introduced, thinking about the pathways, global objectives, what is most important is the figure in the middle. So the adaptive gameplay aesthetics framework I designed so that what you start with is identifying the sensory experience of the player. So in a narrative context, what do you want them to feel physically when they're interacting with your artwork, interactive artwork? And that relates to the game interface, which is the first step once you've identified that sensory experience. And this is the interesting part, that in a way, the interactive media that we use are very analogous to drawing. As I mentioned, the sketch club that I manage, where we draw and respond to physical inputs and express something which is of aesthetic value in relationship to what we see. Then it's important for us to understand what are, in particular, the continuous multi-directional inputs of the media that we're working with. With a PlayStation controller, it's the analog stick, which allows us to have drawing-like gestures. With virtual reality, it can be the controllers in the hand, but also like the pivot of the head and the fact that the whole body can begin to move. And this is what's exciting about the framework, in a way, is that we can use drawing to define the sensory experience. So here's an example, a study I did of Inside, one of my favorite games, which I highly recommend, where at the bottom I did an environment sketch. Second is a blinds drawing, where you're just looking at what you're at the artwork without looking down at the page, and then a summary of the shape language, the lines that I experienced. So here's just an example of this kind of movement, these motion lines in particular, that have the strongest effect on the player. And so what I ask you to do is to just, if you can, if you're not, don't feel too self-conscious, just to follow the motion lines of these characters as if you were copying the signatures at the beginning, and just be aware of what your body is doing. So these are going to be slightly more delicate. In reference, the designers used sort of sea creatures from scuba diving experience. This is the Inside, incredible game, so you can see a very different aesthetic to before. And then the vanquish, which is on the triangular end of the shape spectrum. From everything from the way the character moves to the responsiveness of the camera has been aligned to the triangular shape spectrum. And so even just by studying these games, these are more studies of inside. You can see it's sort of the structure of the narrative or a slice of it, where at the beginning you have more horizontal movements back and forth. Then you enter a submarine in the middle, and the movements become much more jagged. And then on the right is this observational drawing study where the character is actually swimming freely through the water, and the movements are much more delicate and gentle. And so at each change in this interactive narrative, the physical experience is changing. And so when we come to virtual reality and augmented reality, we're taking on this heritage of all of these experiments in painting and animation and comics. And it's important to understand that, again, we're not dealing with a revolution in art. We're dealing with an evolution. So a game like Beat Saber, you can use the trail left behind. You can artistically alter that to amplify certain gestures that you want to convey. This is the Dear Angelica that I mentioned earlier. It's a beautiful experience where even at the beginning, what is happening is that a line is being dynamically drawn. It's sort of the title of the experience. And you can imagine that the viewer, of course, is that the player is following these lines and responding to the aesthetics of what is happening on screen. And so all the time the body is responding to the shape language that you see in a much more physical, full-bodied way than a console game could ever achieve. In a game like Superhot VR, you can see that where enemies are spawned and how bullets fly towards you, you can even have micro adjustments on the position of your head. So you're ducking down, moving things around. And this is a very sort of objective-driven experience. You have to beat the baddies. But it's what I want to highlight is that we can use this in much more artistic and meaningful ways to micro adjust the player. And the last one is just to think about the space itself. So here's a game, Unseen Diplomacy, where you have to, it's sort of like an escape room, virtual escape room, where the player has to crawl through the space, and then once they're through it, they can stand up. And contrast that with something like Escape, sort of Edge of Light, where you have moments where you're in these canyons which have unlimited headspace, and how the player might stand up straight when they're compared to the previous experience. And so, this is just why I asked you, what shape do you identify yourself with? But as designers, we have to ask ourselves, what shapes do we want our players and our audience to adopt? And this is what's most important. And for this, we have to, in a way, move away from thinking about virtual reality and video games as simple, objective-driven experiences where you have to do something. And this aligns with what Walt Disney said about animation, that at first the cartoon medium was just a novelty, but it never really began to hit until we had more than tricks. You have to have pathos or empathy in the thing. And having just focusing games on objectives and beating the end of level boss is the novelty. This is what the first initial state of the medium is, and we have to start to think how we can use these mechanics to motivate more artistic experience. So I just encourage you to be artisans first, to understand your craft, and secondly, that will make you user experience experts, and in whichever field you decide to work with, whether you're in virtual reality, architects, film directors. This is the transmedia value of these principles. And this is my favorite cartoon, which relates to what my son is called Charlie as well, after this character. But Charlie's explaining that if you want to enjoy feeling depressed, you have to stand like this, head down, back bent over. And the worst thing you could do is to tilt your head back, straighten up yourself and look up, because then you would accidentally start to feel better. So don't do that. If you want to feel depressed, stand like this. And this is the power of virtual reality and sort of these interactive experiences to alter our mood in a very artistic, meaningful way, and connect us with what is happening in the virtual space. So thank you very much. Okay. Oh, sorry, it's like I know I overran by quite a bit, so it's but I'm still happy, of course, to answer any questions that you may have. So. Others, I don't have the references here, but there is. Oh, it was just like, is this response to shape language hard coded in us, in our DNA, or is it sort of culturally learned? And can we be sure that the artists actually embedded those shapes into the artwork? And I don't have I wouldn't be able to remember the names of the academic papers that reference this, but there's very clear evidence that this is in our DNA. So how we this passed down in our DNA, that our minds have preferences for particular shapes. There's something which is reinforced during the early stages of development when babies are interacting with their environment. The first time that they cut themselves on a sharp object, their survival instincts reinforce this in a very tactile way. And often it's actually, when it comes to shape language being embedded in artwork and compositions, I would say actually most of the time it's very intuitive. That people just have a physical understanding, or sort of like a natural understanding of what will make the thing they're creating more aggressive or friendlier. But it's important, of course, to have a more sophisticated understanding of this, so that you can have a better command of the artwork that you're sculpting and the experience that you're orchestrating. Thank you very much.